Today, we're really excited to have one of our very first friends of the planet, Beth Allgood, who is now the founder and president of One Nature, which is a group that is focused on the well-being of all beings. So, Beth, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
We're thrilled to have you. You've been one of our very first readers from when we launched. So this is great to see you on this next step that you've taken in launching One Nature. And I wanted to ask, what are the research gaps when it comes to nature, wildlife, and well-being that existed that encouraged you to start One Nature and to start this new venture?
As you know, I've been working on policy for years and really interested in well-being policy for a long time. I was fascinated by Bhutan's gross national happiness policy that they have as an alternative to GDP. Starting probably 10, 11 years ago, I found out about it and I thought, you can do that? Like, I didn't even know you could do that. Really in the past 15 years, countries have been moving towards well-being. Countries have adopted it. There's great research on it. Great organizations are working on it. I've been personally researching about how animals and nature contribute to human well-being, particularly around how nature contributes to well-being and how companion animals contribute to well-being. There's a gap around the wildlife piece. It's harder to kind of get that piece of nature out of nature, right? So how much of the nature's contribution to human well-being is because of the wildlife aspect of it. A lot of that focuses on the economic value, like pollinators, for example. I mean, we'd all die without them, right? So you can tell the economic value of what that brings, but the kind of other values are a little less clear. So there's a gap there, and there's a gap in the well-being movement around that because it hasn't really been clarified. And then finally, I've been working on international conservation and development for 25 years, and so really interested in that intersection of well-being and conservation, particularly in indigenous communities, because they bridge the two movements as well, right? They have a really different worldview about well-being and about conservation. That's starting to be recognized too. So I feel like the research gap is bringing those things together, those movements that are powerful and strong, but they're not aligned. There's a gap around wildlife, what we can learn from well-being and wildlife in all three of those movements.
That's something that I think more and more people are beginning to appreciate. The United Nations this last week started to talk about an accounting framework and trying to quantify some of these values, particularly when it comes to intact ecosystems. They're trying to use this in a way to help boost funding for climate solutions, but it also will have huge impacts for wildlife. So tell us what you think. Do you think you're part of a movement, a bigger movement or a wave that's just starting to crest?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important. So, this well-being as a goal of policy is definitely a movement. And it's this increased understanding that nature can improve well-being and trying to quantify it is really important. And it's a huge first step. I think there's a little bit of a concern that I have. It's a false choice between economic growth or protection of the environment. You can't choose. You can't grow indefinitely with finite resources. It's a flaw in economic theory, but it's just not true, right? But there is something beyond economic value to wildlife that's critical, that we have to make sure this first step goes forward to another step, because when you reduce it to just economic value, ecosystems too, but with wildlife, it's easy to see because they're sentient beings and, we feel a connection to them in a different way than a tree or something like that. When you reduce it to an economic value, then something that's worth more can replace it. And then when ivory is worth more than a live elephant, you have ivory trade and you lose elephants. And then you realize, oh, wait a minute, they had cultural value, they had spiritual value, they had intrinsic value, even if there were no people, and so somehow we have to move beyond a purely economic value to start capturing those elusive other values.
There's an interesting study that my old boss, Enrique Sala, always uses, that a live shark is worth 6 times more than a dead shark. Even though a dead shark is easy to sell, it's harder to quantify in that typical way. There's no market for the live shark, but there's plenty of economic value there. It's just harder to quantify unless you're really thinking about it in that way.
And then we have to move to quantify something beyond economic quantification. What does it mean to our happiness, and how can we measure that in a way that isn't economic? I mean, I don't think the US is ready for gross national happiness, but they have measures that aren't just economic. You don't have to say, does it cost the community $42 million if you do this? But is it going to disrupt their sense of social capital, basically? Going back to these indigenous values, that's really useful because there's a statistic going around that 80% of the world's biodiversity is on the 20% of the land that is indigenous managed. And that's not, it's not a coincidence, right? It's because there's a kind of a different association with the land and the value of the wildlife on it. When we start to expand beyond these current economic values, I think then we can start to appreciate things in a different way. It is a movement, and it is important to start with what we deeply understand, which is economic value, but to move beyond it.
So Beth, to pick up on that a little bit, why do you think it is in the United States, if nature brings such value and happiness to all people, and there's a lot of data to show this, why is there such a discord in our politics, do you think, between valuing, conserving nature and conservation writ large?
I think there's a couple reasons. I think one of them is in polls, people value nature and wildlife overwhelmingly. 86% of the people said viewing wildlife in the natural habitat was important to them. That's huge. I mean, 86% of Americans agreeing on something. It's like, what? But you would think that would result in massive protection policies, right? But then when you ask the question, if you prefer economic growth or protecting wildlife, what would you choose? And people are like, well, economic growth, right? The question should be, do you favor short-term exploitation of our resources and then economic collapse? Or do you prefer happiness and well-being for all? Because those are basically the choices that you're really going to have. At some point, if the questions were reframed, I think people would have different choices, right?
Yeah, we've talked a lot about that when it comes to climate too, and that, over last year during the election, we saw so many varying answers to how important people think climate is. But, my gut feeling was that the way that the questions are posed matters, and how you're tapping into people's understanding of what's actually happening really matters in that question. So, yeah.
There's one other political thing that I think is important to bring up, which is if you're finding a lot of political discord around protecting nature, I think you have to really ask who's benefiting from exploiting nature and who benefits from being in nature. National parks are owned by the citizenry of our country, but exploiting national parks for natural resources benefits the companies that are getting the resources from them. Individually, we enjoy those things, but collectively, we have to protect them. We have to have a societal agreement to protect them and put them in our policies. That's, I'm the one out enjoying nature, but I can't protect it unless we all agree that that's an important policy.
So Beth, tell us a little bit more about some of the shortcomings in the way Congress looks at these issues, the way they calculate growth versus the protection of natural resources, and what would you think we should do differently?
I think that one of the things that we can do differently is definitely to recognize that GDP alone is not adequate, right? It doesn't tell us what we need to know, and it's not expansive enough to protect the resources we have or to make people happy. I mean, obviously right now, Americans disagree about a lot of things. But one thing that research shows that people really want similar things at the core. We want safety, we want good education for our children, and we want nature, and we want wildlife, around. And so I think one thing Congress could do, or really anyone in policy and interested in this could do, is to ask the American people what matters to them. What do they really value? It could really bring people together to realize that we're not that different. We want the same things. And if we had policies that reflected those things, it would improve our well-being, but it would also unite us in a time when we really need to recognize that there are more things that can bring us together than divide us. So I think that in a lot of countries, this process of just asking people what they really want instead of assuming that this past behavior around growing is what people need has made a real difference to moving forward on and actually getting these well-being policies in policy.
To pivot a little bit, since this is Women's History Month and we have been actively trying to talk to as many women as we can in our interview series, I wanted to ask, as an entrepreneur, what advice do you have for women that perhaps see gaps out there in their fields or opportunities to pursue those ventures? And how has your pursuit of your new venture of One Nature brought you that personal happiness? Since we're on the subject of collective happiness, I think, it's also important to focus on how we can, find those avenues in our own lives.
This whole thing actually started because I had 15 years ago, I had my own personal health crisis and I was like, oh, I need to be happier. Then I found out about Bhutan. I'm like, oh, there's this whole world happiness thing. So that's how it started. I've seen that there are systemic issues, right? And I wanted to work on them. And when COVID hit, I was like, this is the time. This is the time to, I can't wait any longer. I have to do it. And people are like, you are crazy. I mean, there's like, you're going to quit your job and start this new thing. I mean, I felt like I'd done my homework. I knew what I wanted to do. I knew what needed to be done. All that. So it wasn't like I just pitched it and ran out. I had a plan. I knew it was what I wanted to do was to participate in this movement. So I'm happy. I mean, I wake up every day and I'm excited about doing what I do. And I'm excited about contributing what I feel I can contribute. I don't know how to do half the things that I have to do. I knew how to do programmatic stuff and management kind of stuff. And, I have my master's in business, but I don't know how to do a website. All this stuff is totally new.
You'll learn. You're going to
yeah, but you learn, like you do, you learn.
You learn, and it makes you grow and stretch. And even that's good, right?
Exactly. You can't get bored. And people have helped. I mean, people have supported me and come out of the woodwork to help me with things I don't know how to do. And so with Zoom, I can still connect with people even though I'm sitting here in my house, and everybody's in the same boat. So in that case, the timing wasn't bad,
Yeah.
So I guess
upside down. So just go for it, right?
Right. So my advice would be, do what makes you happy. I mean, have a plan. Don't go off half-cocked, but do what makes you happy. Have a plan. Ask for support, plan that everything will take longer than you think, but there's time to do what you need to do and do what makes you happy, because that's what the world needs, is to be happier.
Definitely. And you should definitely believe in yourself and your project, because it's got a lot of growth still to go. You have a lot of ways to grow that happiness around you. So tell us about World Happiness Day, which is coming up. Very exciting.
Yeah, so exciting. So, it's not like a typical Hallmark holiday, but it's in 2012, the UN resolved that happiness and well-being should be a part of policy, government policy. And that's a little bit of a wonky start for a holiday, admittedly. But every World Happiness Day, they release the new World Happiness Report. So that's where, when they say what's the happiest country, whatever, it's just based on the report that's released on World Happiness Day. And that is the 20th of March. And so that's this Saturday. And it's sort of a moment for people to gather at the UN normally. Of course, now there'll be a virtual thing. People talk about progress towards happiness as a goal for societies and for countries. And it'll be even happier this year because we'll get to be on our own event, on our own panel, talking about how animals make us happy.
That's right.
And Monica, you'll be moderating, and that's very exciting.
So we have a panel on Saturday to celebrate World Happiness Day with some great guests to talk about the importance of animals, wildlife, and pet to people's happiness, and why we think it's so important for everyone's well-being to have some connection to nature somehow in their lives. So we're looking forward to that. Beth, we'll see you on Saturday for that panel, and we hope our viewers will tune in. It's at 4 Eastern. So thank you, Beth. This was great.
Beth.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you, and thanks for being interested in happiness and well-being for all
of our day.
Yeah, have a happy day.
Yeah. Thank you.